Hello everyone. My name is Tommy Jonsson, like Stefan said, and I'm a family physician. I work in Lund, a town nearby here, and but I'm also a researcher here at the Center for Primary Health Care at Lund University. Let's see how this works. Great. So, first some numbers. I'm going to talk about clinical trials here in Sweden, and I found all in all 5 clinical studies on Paleolithic diet from Sweden, and 3 of those are RCTs, random clinical trials. These 5 studies have resulted in 8 published papers from a total of 41 authoring researchers, and total study participants are 136, 92 women and 44 men. So almost there are 2/3 women compared to 1/3 of men. Okay, so I've put them here, all the trials, on a timeline with each study's papers grouped together. And each paper is marked with the publication year. And so we have the first study coming here in 2007, followed by another one the same year. And it also has gotten a follow-up paper in 2010. And then they follow, you see there, at 2009, 2013, and 14. I don't know why the one at 13 is not red. I suppose it's something to do with Apple computer? Okay. And just going to shift here. I'm not sure how this works. Okay, anyway. So, moving on. Before doing these clinical studies on humans, we actually published the world's first and only animal RCT on Paleolithic diet in 2006. This one. And so I'm just going to briefly mention it, so you get the whole picture. And this was an animal RCT on 23 domestic swine, and they were randomized to either a Paleolithic diet or a cereal-based swine feed from 2 to 17 months of age. And in the study, we mainly examined cardiovascular risk factors. And we found that briefly, that Paleolithic diet caused higher insulin sensitivity, lower C-reactive protein, and lower diastolic blood pressure when compared to this cereal-based swine feed in domestic swine. And let's see here. Stefan, is there a way to see more of the presentation text here? Because I've made these notes, so I want to see more of this. You don't know? Oh, okay. So it's excuse me. I have it here. To a PC. So, thank you. And we are here somewhere. Right. Okay, so back on track, and One nice thing about this trial in domestic swine was an unexpected finding when we did immunohistochemistry. It indicated a pancreatic inflammation because, as you see in the slide, in the picture here, there are the cells lighting up is white blood cells, leukocytes. And they were more than double in frequency compared to the sample pancreases from the Paleolithic group. And this, we looked around in the literature. This had not been described before, and this finding, as far as I know, it still haven't been followed up in some way. Okay, so that was the animal RCT. Now we go to the clinical trials here in Sweden on humans. So 6 months after we published the animal RCT, another research group published this. This is the first human trial in Sweden on Paleolithic diet. And this is a study on 14 healthy volunteers. They ate Paleolithic diet for 3 weeks. And again, it studied cardiovascular risk factors. And it was mostly students, as I understand it when they looked at it. And hello. Okay. Anyway, what they found in this study was that weight decreased, weight circumference decreased, and systolic blood pressure also decreased somewhat. And also PI1, which is a platelet activator inhibitor, dropped dramatically. And that's important in cardiovascular disease in forms of clotting and forming blood clots when you get a heart infarction. So, okay. Then a few months later, Staffan published this. This is the world's first human RCT on Paleolithic diet. And if we look at this, this is 29 men with ischemic heart disease. And also, they either have glucose intolerance or type 2 diabetes. And they also have a waist circumference above 94 centimeters. So that's the group, 29 men. And then he randomized them to either a Paleolithic diet or a Mediterranean diet. And they ate these diets for 3 months. So we have 2 groups, 2 different diets. And in this case, these persons with ischemic heart disease, the recommended diet was Mediterranean diet, so that was why those 2 diets were head-to-head. And it obviously examined mostly for cardiovascular risk factors in this study also. And okay, and so let's see here. Okay, so what did we find? Yes, Paleolithic diet caused improved glucose tolerance in an oral glucose tolerance test. Also, both groups had a reduction in waist circumference, but it was larger in the Paleolithic group. And minus 5.6 centimeters, that's not the difference, that's the total. I'm just putting the total numbers for you. In all these studies, so you get a grasp of what happened during a study to the persons. And as I saw, this was compared to Mediterranean-like diet. And it's not explicitly said so in the conclusion of the paper, but in the Paleolithic group, when you did the oral glucose tolerance test at the end, all subjects in the Paleolithic group had normal values of glucose, compared to the Mediterranean group, where 5 still had diabetic values. Okay. And we did a follow-up paper on this study published in 2010. We looked at satiation, which is what I'm mostly interested in, perhaps. And briefly, we found that both groups were equally satiated when eating. So they were equally hungry when started eating. They were equally satiated when they ended eating. They ate approximately the same amount of meals and so forth. But the Paleolithic group needed to consume less energy, less calories to become equally satiated. And we also looked at the satiety hormone leptin. Leptin is it's secreted by adipose tissue in the body, and it's circulating in the blood, so it's a signal for the brain to know how much fat is there in the body. And it has effect on a lot of systems, but it affects how much we want to eat, basically. And what we found here was a trend for a greater relative decrease of leptin in the Paleolithic group. And if I should comment on that, was that this was not a big study, and so individual patients can have dramatic effects. There was one patient in the Paleolithic group who ate not very Paleolithic. He had the same cereal consumption as in the Mediterranean group, actually. So when he was removed, this would have been a significant effect, but we chose to present it as this instead. Anyway. Then I published my first RCT. This is in 2009. Okay. And in this study, this was an even smaller study. This was only on 13 patients, but instead this was a crossover study. So that's make it a bit stronger statistically than if you have two different groups. But it's there are drawbacks as well. But this time we didn't study people with ischemic heart disease. This was on patients with type 2 diabetes, and they didn't have any insulin treatment. And they were randomized to either start with Paleolithic diet or diabetes diet, eat that for 3 months, and then they switched and they ate the other diet. So every participant ate both diets. And we looked at cardiovascular risk factors. And what did we find? We find that a Paleolithic diet caused lower HbA1c, and that's the long-term sugar control, reflecting how well you have, how good low sugar values you have had the last 2 to 3 months. So that dropped, and triglycerides dropped, diastolic blood pressure, weight and waist circumference all dropped, and HDL, which is perhaps the benign lipid, it rose, so that was also good. And it was again compared to a diabetes diet this time. And we published a follow-up paper also on this study, and that came last year. Again, we looked at satiety, but this time we also wanted to get some more qualitative data from the patients. So they answered a survey with open-ended questions, what they thought about the diet and how it had affected their health. And we found that, again, the Paleolithic diet were as satiating as the diabetes diet. Also, the same result as in the Mediterranean diet, but it needed less calories doing so. So this is This is an important finding, because before we did these studies, we had no idea. Are they walking around feeling more hungry than the other group, but they don't like the food, so they are eating less, and that's why they are losing more weight, or what's going on here? But now we know, we have done 2 studies, we know we have the same results. They are equally satiated. So what did they think? What were the more qualitative aspects? And so it was a very small study, and it's not easy to interpret always qualitative, but on the safe side, I think we can state that they thought it was a good diet if you want to lose weight. But it was difficult to stay on the diet because there were different reasons. But of course, the Paleolithic diet is a larger step away from the normal diet than a diabetes diet is, so it's harder to stay on. We've also done leptin studies in this study, not published yet, but there is it's the same as in the Staffan study, that we see that the leptin is lower. There is a trend for lower leptin again here in this study. So we see, it's always reassuring that we see the same kind of effects in all the studies. So that's good. And now we're approaching present day, because this is last year. Another research group published a paper on this study. This is a research group from the northern part of Sweden, Umeå. And this is a small study, but it's really interesting. It's done on 10 postmenopausal women with a BMI above 27. They ate Paleolithic diet for 5 weeks, and they were actually given prepared meals from the local hospital, 3 meals a day for these 5 weeks. And they were also told that you can eat more than this, so you're free to eat as much as you want, and if we are going to eat more, here is a list of what we want you to eat, and here's information about the Paleolithic diet. So they were free to eat as much as possible, but with this design, they really tried to make sure that they were eating a Paleolithic diet. And this study examined again cardiovascular risk factors, but they were also interested in lipid content of liver and muscle, and they studied this using an MRI. With a spectroscopy added, so they could, from the MRI signals, see the lipid contents of the tissues. And why were they interested in this lipid in the liver and the muscle? It's because if the fat accumulates where it's not supposed to, if it's not subcutaneous, and if it accumulates in the liver or the muscle, then it's not good. Could be a link between this abdominal obesity and insulin resistance, and following increased risk of cardiovascular disease. This is the pattern they see happening to women after menopause. So that's why they chose this group. Also, with this given food, they also met dietitians every week. They made daily food records, and they had a food interview before and after the study. They also checked for physical activity and found that they established that there was no change in physical activity during the study, which is, of course, important to rule out in this kind of diet study. So it's small, but it's highly controlled, and it's looking at a new thing here, lipid content. So very interesting. And what did they find? Well, they found that the Paleolithic diet caused a lower energy intake, a drop in weight, waist, circumference, again, diastolic blood pressure, glucose, lipids, C-peptide, this and also leptin. This was not a trend, but an actual drop in leptin, and also HOMA indices, which is a measure of insulin resistance. And the MRI spectroscopy showed a decrease of the lipid content in the liver by 49%, which is huge, I think, in 5 weeks, but no change in muscle. And okay, so this is not randomized. There's no control group, but it's very interesting, and also to read in their discussion. It's the importance they see in pursuing this and making more studies on this. Okay. So in this same group for northern part of Sweden, they published this year another article, a paper on this study, and we'll have a look at it. It's again, it's postmenopausal women with BMI above 27, and they included 70 women. They were randomized to Paleolithic diet, or in this case, these are healthy people, so they are randomized to a Nordic nutrition recommendations diet. So that's the general recommendations for a healthy person here in Scandinavia. And this is a long-term study. This is the first long-term study for 2 years. So half would eat Paleolithic diet and half would eat Nordic nutrition recommendations, and this will go on for 2 years. They would look at cardiovascular risk factors, and they would look. It's the same thinking behind this as the last one. They're thinking about fat. Where is it positioned in the body, and how does it affect the health? And this, so they look at fat mass, and they measure it by doing dual energy X-ray absorptiometry. So you would lay down on a bench, and a machine would pass over you, and you would do some calculations, and you would get the fat mass. So okay. Also, this was also for 2 years. So the group, they had 12 group sessions. Meeting dietitians 12 times during these 2 years. That's a lot. That's good. They also did a lot of dietary assessment. So for a dietary assessment for 4 days, the participant would record what they are eating, and they did this a lot of times. The first 6 months they did it every month. So before study, 6 months every month, and then for 9, 12, 18, and 24 months. So lots and lots of dietary data on these people. To look on compliance, they wanted to see if they ate as much protein as they were supposed to do. So they looked at urine and at nitrogen excretion as a biomarker for protein intake. And I can already tell you right now that in the end they found that there was no difference between the groups. So they were apparently eating about the same amount of protein. So they established that they were not really quite meeting the goals for protein intake in the groups. But what did they found otherwise in this study? Yes, it caused a more pronounced fat loss from the Paleolithic diet. So both groups lost fat, but it was more pronounced in the Paleolithic group. At least when you look at 6 months, because this effect, they still had lost fat later on and at the end of the 2 years. But the difference between the two groups were not significant anymore at 24 months. There was another decrease in triglycerides, which remained at both 6 and 24 months. And this is also interesting because it's a link to their other finding about lipid content in the liver. Okay. So this was the first long-term study. So we have to think about this and why was there not so many positive differences between the groups the longer the study went on. Okay, and actually they have some more information of this here, because less than a month ago they published a follow-up paper from this study, and this is a qualitative study looking at barriers and facilitators to weight loss in a diet intervention. So and it's not very, it doesn't talk very much specifically about the Paleolithic group or the other group. It's more in general terms what enabled you to lose weight, or what was the problem for you to lose weight. But okay. Okay. Okay, back on track. Yes, so they made interviews, not with all the women, but with, they selected 12 women. And they also included 4 from the women who dropped out of the study. So, and they chose 4 variety of their marital status, variety of age, and variety for where they lived, in town or outside of town. And so they wanted to get a broad picture. And so they explored these barriers and facilitators. And they found something there, but I'm not going to discuss it here. But when we're going to do follow-up studies, we want to consider them when we're planning future studies. So what did they say, which was interesting regarding the Paleolithic diet? And in my summary, I think they basically say the same thing we found in our previous qualitative study. It was instrumental in weight loss, but it was difficult to adhere to, due to various, it could be money, or it was different from the normal food, or other points. So, conclusions. Now, we've tested the Paleolithic diet here in these clinical trials in Sweden. We've tested it against Mediterranean, diabetes, and the Nordic nutrition recommendation diets. And all studies have yielded positive results. They have mostly been on cardiovascular risk factors, but we've also looked at satiety and ectopic fat deposition. And we've also gotten some qualitative data. So, yeah, I think we're moving on. Most studies so far, they have been small and short. Some of them have been uncontrolled, unrandomized. Now we've also gotten our first long-term study. It was 2 years. 70 started the study, only 49, however, completed the whole study. So, I think so far we're doing quite well. Thank you.